Introduction to Force.com for developers. My name is Corey Cowgill, and I'll be leading you through these exercises today. Safe harbor, there's nothing here we'll be talking about that isn't publicly accessible. So there's a lot of channels that you can get help with. You can go to @SalesforceDevs on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Google+, basically all these different channels if you have questions after this session. You can also hit up the session feed in the Dreamforce application. So, what's our agenda for today? So we're going to go over the platform overview. So what is Force.com? How does it work? We're going to go over writing Apex classes. So you guys are going to write an Apex class to send out emails and other things. We're going to show you the SOQL language. So SOQL, which is Salesforce Object Query Language. It's similar to SQL. We're going to show you how to write triggers in the database. We're going to show you how to write Visualforce pages. So how do you build rich UIs? We're going to show you how to write controller extensions, which is basically the logic that sits behind a Visualforce page so that you can build rich business logic into your user interfaces. And then, depending on if we have time, we'll look at some of the REST APIs, unit testing on the platform, batching and scheduling. So if we have extra time, depending on how we run at the end, this is a long session, it's about 2.5 hours. So if we have time, we'll go into those things. Before I move on, I will say that this session is for developers. So we're assuming that you guys know either Java, .NET, or some other object-oriented programming language, and you're already familiar with basic computer science concepts. Does that sound good to everybody? About what everybody thought? Okay. And they're working on bringing in some helpers if you guys need help while the sessions are going on. So the first thing I want everybody to do is I want everybody to go to this URL, and this is where the workbook this is the workbook that will be going on. It's on GitHub. So I'll leave that up there for a second so everybody can type it in. And this is going to be the interactive workbook that we're going to follow along through today's session. Hello. Yeah. And if you have trouble accessing it, raise your hand. You need help with, I think we. Okay. So what I'll do is the helpers will come around. For those of you who had trouble, please raise your hand, and they'll get you onto the site. And if not, we'll keep moving along. Okay. So while they're doing that, while they're helping you get onto the work site, I'll just go a little bit about Salesforce. So Salesforce Platform is the fastest path from idea to app. So on a traditional Java application, for example, I have a Java background. I come from Java Enterprise Edition. You have a lot of different things that you have to do. You have to buy and set up the hardware, the server. You have to install complex software. So a lot of time you have a lot of frameworks and stacks that you have to pile on top of each other. You have to define the user access sometimes at the database layer and also within your view layer, your application layer. You have to maybe have a different reporting and analytics product like Crystal Reports or some other tool that you have to install. You have build and test security, so outside the platform I have to set up a whole JUnit and a whole other suite of testing products. If I want to make it mobile and social, I have to basically build a mobile app from scratch to do that. So that's why traditional enterprise software development took 12 months to roll out a project. With the Salesforce platform, all of that stuff is baked into the platform, and it basically escalates the time that you can go to market with your applications much faster. So basically you spend less time with infrastructure, less time setting up your environments, and more time building the apps and the business logic that basically that's why we're all here. We want to focus on building apps, not necessarily managing all of the bits and pieces of an application. So the Salesforce platform, Salesforce1 Platform. So this is an interesting slide because what this will do is this will tell you what all the product offerings are from Salesforce. So there's a number of products that you may get confused when you're out on the floor and you see what is Heroku, what is ExactTarget. Basically, there's a number of products. In the top tier, you have the Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Marketing Cloud, App Exchange, Custom Apps, Partner Apps. Those are all basically kind of the software as a service offerings of the platform. So those require very little coding except for maybe the custom apps piece. Then you have the Salesforce1 app that sits underneath that. That's the mobile experience. That's the iOS app that you can install, or the Android app, or even the Windows Phone app. So that sits on top of that, so you can access all those things through the Salesforce1 app. Underneath that, you have the Salesforce1 Platform APIs. So these are all the SOAP and REST APIs that expose all the services to either those applications or external applications. And then underneath that, you have basically the core services. This is where the core functionality lies. You have Force.com, which is the underlying technology behind Salesforce.com. When you log in, you create custom objects. You create business logic triggers, Visualforce Pages. You have Heroku for building custom customer-facing applications. So that sits on the Heroku tier. That sits on a dyno. You can build rich customer-facing applications. And then you have ExactTarget for marketing. So basically, that's why you may see, like, what is Salesforce1? Salesforce1 is all of these things, all of these offerings that Salesforce gives you. How many of you are using the Salesforce1 mobile app? Yeah, good, sweet. So basically, the message here is that anytime you build anything in Salesforce, it's automatically mobile enabled, so that when you build a custom object and you build a page layout, you can access that on the mobile device. So as a developer, as an administrator, you can customize the application. And you can put Visualforce Pages inside of for our intents and purposes, you can put Visualforce Page inside of the Salesforce1 mobile app. So you can build mobile apps within the application using containers. So there's two approaches to development that you'll hear frequently within the platform. It's very different than what you may be used to in like Java or .NET or another application language. There's the declarative approach and there's a programmatic approach. So in the declarative approach, you have all the things that basically somebody can do with clicks. You don't have to write any code to do any of this. So you can create page layouts, which are the user interfaces in the standard pages. You have record types. Record types are basically a way for you to partition business logic on an object. So you could create, for example, an account object, and you could have two record types, one called business account and one called personal account. And those would basically behave differently in the screen. They could have different page layouts. You could report on them differently. You could assign different security to the record types. You have formula fields, validation rules, and workflow approvals in the business logic tier. So formula fields are basically, they're calculated in real time. They're just what you'd expect it. You could say, add the total amount of an opportunity plus an end date to figure out, what's the stage of an opportunity. They're only calculated at runtime, though. They're never persisted in the database. You have validation rules, which are basically for you who are familiar with SQL, it's like a constraint. So you can say things like, don't let them save a record if the first name is not filled out in a record. If the phone number is greater than 10 characters, don't let them save the record, give them an error message. You have workflows and approvals. So workflows and approvals fire at the database layer. So these interact basically, you could say when somebody saves a contact record, automatically update the account with a counter of how many contacts were on that account. At the data model layer, you have custom objects, custom fields, and relationships. So these basically are similar to the SQL tables that you may be familiar with. They're similar to that. So you don't have to code that. You're not going to have to write a script that says, create table, give me alter table. You don't have to do any of that. You can all do that with the Click development environment. And a lot of this declarative stuff actually gets done by either your developers or a lot of your times your BAs, your business analysts will actually do this a lot on your projects. So it's a different mind approach in that traditionally developers had to do everything. In Salesforce, we give the BAs a more handed role so that they can take the pressure off the developers so the developers can focus on the really rich and complex logic. So that's the declarative approach side. So that's stuff that, just setting up the environment. On the right is now you have all your stuff that you're going to have to program. You're going to have to write code. So Visualforce Pages, Visualforce components, these are basically your UI components. It's very similar to basically if you have JSF and templates in that. So Visualforce Pages and Visualforce components are very similar to JSF or .NET C# pages. Business logic, you have Apex controllers and Apex triggers. So these are basically your business logic, your Java-like classes. So this is where you would write this is an email handler, this is an account trigger handler, this is a domain class to handle all the business logic around an opportunity. And finally, you have your data model layer, which for a developer, what you're going to have access to is a number of APIs. So you have the metadata API, so you can manipulate and move your objects between environments. You have your REST API, so you can access all of the data through a REST API. So you can say, query and get me all of the accounts for contacts for an account, or you can do things like insert records from a mobile device. So if you want to build a mobile application, a lot of times people use the REST API because it's so lightweight. There's also an accompanying SOAP API if you have a legacy system and you have to integrate with an enterprise SOAP API. And finally, there's a bulk API. So if you need to load millions of records in the platform, the bulk API allows you to move records in bulk in the millions and millions of records. So what we're going to build today, so that's kind of just setting the groundwork that just kind of sets the groundwork for where we're going to go today. So we're going to focus a lot on that programmatic side of building stuff. So we're going to install a managed package, which basically will set up all that click stuff for us so you don't have to do that, and we can focus on building the Apex and Visualforce pages. So does that kind of make sense with everybody? Does that gel? Does that make sense? Any questions on the difference between declarative and programmatic side of the house? Okay. All right, so if not, we're going to get busy. So basically what we're going to build is we're going to build a conference app, since we're all at a conference right now. And we're going to use it to basically, you can manage sessions and speakers, automatically send confirmation emails, customize the user interface with Visualforce Pages, upload speaker pictures, add a little bit of Flickr integration to see it pull in a picture from a Flickr page and show it in a Visualforce page. So, and then basically if we have extra credit time, we'll go over additional things on the platform that you may have questions about. So. All right, so the first thing I want everybody to do is we need to sign up. You need to sign up for a developer account. How many people signed up for the fresh developer account before they came here? Okay, a number of people, great. Anybody who hasn't signed up for a developer account, please go to the developer.salesforce.com sign up page and sign up for a new developer edition, which you'll be building the app in. And if you need help, raise your hand and one of the helpers will come over and make sure that you get into the developer account. And then again, we have the link to the workbook that we'll be going through. So I'm going to assume that everybody got through the signing up for their developer account. I'll give everybody a minute while they do that. And while you're doing that, I will pull up the workbook. So here's everybody should have got this link when they went to the earlier link. And we're doing modular 1, create a developer edition account. Hopefully most people have this done. I'm going to move on. So how many of you have installed this managed package yet? Anybody? A few people? Okay. So basically, if you don't know what a managed or unmanaged package is, this is technically actually an unmanaged package. An unmanaged package is essentially a way for you to bundle up your application and deploy it to other environments. So this is an unmanaged package. So what this unmanaged package is going to have is it's going to have all the objects in the fields and all the declarative, the clicks, not code functions. We're going to install that in our org so we don't have to do that and we can focus on programming. So I want you to log into your developer edition account. from this page, click the link. It's going to give you some instructions to install the unmanaged package. I'll give everybody a minute to make sure that everybody has that unmanaged package installed. Everybody getting it okay? Everybody got the link? Okay. So I'm going to log into my org. I've installed the app. And what you'll do is once you finish installing the app in the upper right, you'll have all of what's called your apps in the upper right. And you should have the conference app. And you're going to click that. Everybody see this screen yet? Everybody with me? You're with me? If you're with me, raise your hand, please, so I can see who's following along. Okay, good. If you have questions, raise your hands, and the helpers will help you out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and enter some test data for the speakers. I'm going to say first name, Bill, last name Gates, Bill Gates. Actually, I'm going to put my own email out here. Okay. And great philanthropist. Click Save. I'm going to clone this, and I'm going to create another one for Steve Jobs. And he may not be a philanthropist, but a great designer. So go ahead. We have to create some test data because we're going to use this data to query using SOQL later on, and it's going to basically be what we're going to use for our test data. So go ahead and enter in a few sample speakers. I'm going to go ahead and enter in a sample session. And I'm going to click on the Sessions tab. I'm going to click on New Recent Sessions. I'm going to say session is beginning mobile development. Session date, time, I'm going to say today. Description, learn how to develop mobile apps. Level, beginner. I'm going to click Save and New. You can click the Save and New button, and that'll let you keep going and entering in the test data. I'm going to say advanced programming. And I'm going to say advanced. Okay. So go ahead and everybody enter in just a few test records for your speakers in your sessions. Once you enter that, what you need to do is we need to basically assign the users to the new session speaker. So I'm on step 4 here to assign a speaker to a session. So I'm going to click on the detail view of a session. Session name, session date. See where it has this new session speaker button here at the bottom, this related list. I'm going to click this. And I'm going to click the little magnifying glass to make a lookup relationship to another speaker. And I'm going to click Save. And then I'm going to go back to my other beginning mobile development. I'm going to click New Session Speaker and link this to Bill Gates. So now I've done the test data setup. Everybody following along? Everybody able to create the test data? Who was not able to create the test data? Okay. So in the details views for a session, click New Session Speaker. We've done that. So now we can move on to actually getting into some of the fun stuff, which is we're going to start building Apex classes. So now we're actually going to write our Apex classes. And I'll give everybody another second to catch up. Okay, so now we're going to start with writing our Apex classes. So how many of you here are familiar with Apex? I'm assuming somewhat, basically, you've heard of. I know that there's this thing and it's Apex, and I've been told I need to support this application or I need to build it. How many of you are not familiar with Apex at all? Okay. So Apex is basically, the Salesforce platform language. It's very similar to Java. In fact, what actually happens is when you write an Apex class, it compiles into Java bytecode, and that's what actually runs on the Salesforce servers. So a lot of the syntax that you'll see is very similar to Java. It's object-oriented, so you can extend, basically objects can inherit from one another, you can override methods, you can build virtual and abstract classes, things like that. It's strongly typed, just like Java, so when you basically say this object is this type of object, it's not a loosely typed language. So you can build classes and interfaces, like I was saying. It's all cloud-based, so all the cloud-based compiling, debugging, and unit testing happens on the Salesforce platform, which is different than like if you built a Java application and you're running a JVM on your local machine. That doesn't exist with Salesforce. So when you build an Apex class, you're building it in the cloud when you code, and every time you click save, it's saving it in the cloud on the development environment. So for those of you who are familiar with Java, what I'll say is, what's the same is that you have primitive data types. So like integer, decimal, string. It has a lot of the primitive data types, the same as Java does. Character, for example. It has flow control, of course, because it's a programming language. So you can do if statements, you can do for statements, you can do while statements. The one caveat is you cannot do case statements, and it's a constant nag in every developer. If you like to use case statements, for whatever reason, Salesforce has not implemented case statements. So that's one gotcha, is you can't do case statements, so you have to do if. You'll have to do an if-else, long if-else statement. It also has exception handling, so you can basically create your own exceptions, throw and catch your own exceptions. And it also has collections, lists, sets, and maps. What I will tell you is when you actually start developing in real life, collections have a very important role in Salesforce because basically everything has to be bulkified, as you'll see as we get into the coding. But what's different is that you're going to rely more on maps, lists, and sets than you may have done in the past. Now, what's different about the platform? Well, it's case insensitive for one. So if you're familiar with Java, everything has to be, if you write camel case, you can't do another object with that same case. But you could do something like, if I did all uppercase and all lowercase, those are two different variables. Salesforce Apex is not case sensitive. Single quote strings instead of double quotes. So you'll do, for example, Joe here. That's how you would do a string literal. If you're like me and you switch back between Java and Apex, that can get a little confusing because you get used to putting the single character literal and then you do the quotes. So that can be fun. So it does single quote strings. The ID field is a new data type. So ID is basically the Salesforce 18-character ID. How many of you are familiar with the Salesforce ID and some of the unique quirks with it? Okay. So some of you, for those of you who don't know, what you can do with the ID is any URL endpoint in Salesforce, you can actually copy the 18-character ID and get directly to the record. So, for example, this is a nice little tidbit to you know that I always do. On the end of a record is on all your URLs for the standard page. This is the Salesforce ID, in case you didn't know. So you can jump around in the UI to any record by putting that Salesforce ID up in there. So if I click on another record, that's the 18-character ID. So in Apex, that is its own data type. And it can do things like you can get the prefix, which identifies the type of object that you're using and other things. The other difference is it has built-in support for data access. So if you're in Java, you would do something like with JDBC, or you would do, you have to get a driver to access the database layer. Maybe you'd use Hibernate and HQL to access your entities. In Salesforce, you have built-in support for the data model. So every time you build an object, which again, I said an object is like a table in SQL, similar. Every time you build an object, that becomes a first-class Apex object called an S object, Salesforce object, and you can access the fields and you can query for that directly inline in the code. So you don't have to add another framework or driver layer to access your data. It's all built into the platform. So an example of an Apex class is public class mortgage calculator. Again, you do public. That means it's accessible by everybody. You can do private. You can do global, which means it's accessible by everybody. Class defines it as a class. And then you give it a name with the open and closed brackets. You can define attributes for your objects. So double amount, public double rate, public integer years with getters and setters. These getters and setters, just like in Java, if you were building a controller page for a JSF page, it gives these things access through the view layer. So you can do getters and setters. These are your mutators. And then we have, basically, you can build methods. So it's a public and a return type of double. And here we say we want to calculate a monthly payment, giving it integer, monthly rate, and then we want to return an amount. So as you can see here, this looks a lot like Java, right? Yeah. So how many of you are familiar with the developer console? A few of you? Okay. So the developer console is it's basically the browser-based IDE. That's what we're going to be using in this session today to go through and code our application. There's also several tools on the desktop that you can use. I use the Force.com IDE a lot. And the reason I use the Force.com IDE is because I can pull down all of my code and do source code scans and other things. So it's helpful. Maven's Mate is a very popular IDE tool also. And there's also a Force.com command line interface that you can use to basically upload and download your metadata. So how many of you here are familiar with Eclipse and using Eclipse at work? Okay. How many of you are using Visual Studio? Okay. So it's similar to that. So as I was saying, what we're going to do is we're going to use the developer console today. It's a browser-based IDE. Create classes, triggers, pages, execute Apex anonymously. What that means is you can run chunks of code in the execute Apex, and it'll run and it'll fire, and you don't have to actually save the class or the methods. We're going to execute SOQL queries in this, so we're going to show you how you can do SOQL. I like to say that SOQL is similar just enough to SQL where it's frustrating for people, because you can't do things like joins, but you can do things like parent and child queries. So it's very frustrating when you first come on to learning SOQL, and if you don't know some of its nuances, you think, oh, I can just do a join. No, you can do parent-child queries. You can run your unit tests from here, and you can review your debug log. So everything that you write out, you can do a debug log statement, trace, see where all of the lines of code are executing. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the next lab here in the workbook. So let's see here. So everybody on this page here for Module 3, creating an Apex class, ready to get started and actually stop listening to me talk and start coding some stuff. Everybody on this page? Good? Okay. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go into the Salesforce and start up the developer console. So you can get to the developer console from the upper right, and you click developer console up here. And this is going to fire up a new window. This is where you can do a lot of your development. You can edit your classes, you can see your logs, you can execute SOQL queries in it. So from here, I'm going to say File. I'm going to say New. I'm going to say Apex class. It's going to say what's the name of the class. And I'm going to say the name of the class that they want me to call this is Email Manager. I'm going to click OK. And this is going to do my getter. It's going to default create a public class. That's fine. And then they want me to say implement this class to say send email with a string body text. Okay. I'm just going to be lazy and copy this. Okay. And how many of you do the brackets straight down, and how many do the brackets on the end and then the beginning? I'm old school. I think it's probably because I learned Pascal when I was a kid, and I was taught to do brackets straight down, which is funny because everybody else in the world seems to do it the other way now. So let's take a minute and look at this method that we've built here. Public void send email. Okay. So this method is going to it's not going to return anything. It's a void. That means it's not going to return anything. And then I'm going to pass in an address, a subject, and a body. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a standard library class called messaging.singleEmailMessage. Now, the thing about Salesforce and Apex is what's kind of cool is that you don't have to worry about all the libraries. Like if I was doing this on Java Enterprise Edition, I would have to probably import the Java Mail classes, and I'd have to set up a daemon server. I'd have to do a whole bunch of work to get email to work. In a few lines of code, I don't have to do any of that. I can create an email service to send emails or receive emails, which is really powerful. So here you can say we're using the messaging class, single email message. We instantiate it. And we're going to say here, create a list of addresses that we're going to send it. And in this line of code, what we're saying is I'm only going to send it to one person, but I'm instantiating a new array of strings. And when I instantiate it like this is a shortcut here you can do. When you do the open brackets and close brackets, just like in Java, it'll create the assignment to the array. And then on my mail instance, I'm setting the address, the subject, and the body that was passed in, and I'm doing a send email call out. Send out the email. And I'm not doing anything. I'm not checking the response. This is basically a fire and forget method. And I'm going to click save. Now when I click save, what's going to happen is real time it's saving it and it's compiling it. And if it doesn't compile, it will not save it to the Salesforce tier. So what that means is it will never let you save something in your environment that won't compile. So a lot of times people get confused. First-time developers are confused and they're developing and this doesn't compile, and they leave their get coffee, they come back, and they may have closed their window like, oh, what happened to the work I was working on? Well, if it doesn't compile, it won't save it to the database or to the Salesforce cloud. So that's just a handy hint in real life is if your code isn't compiling, don't just leave. Like make sure before you save it that it's compiling or have it backed up. Many a times I have lost code by forgetting to compile and save. All right, so everybody following along okay so far? Everybody get the email manager class created? Anybody not get the email manager class created? Okay? So we're going to move on, and we're going to send an email now. So we're going to basically instantiate and use this method. So here's some code that we can execute in our developer console. Is again an anonymous execute. So I'm going to copy this and paste this into my developer console. So to get to the execute anonymous, I'm going to click debug, open, execute anonymous code. I'm going to paste this code in here. And for your email address, again, a string literal using a single apostrophe. I'm going to say speaker confirmation. Thank you for speaking at the conference. And what I'm going to do when I click execute, what's going to happen is Salesforce is going to compile this anonymous Apex code into bytecode, and it's going to run it, and it's going to send me an email. So I'm going to click execute. And what you'll notice is when I clicked execute, I got a log. And that log is basically what happened. I can double click on this log, and this is the transaction that occurred on Salesforce. And you get all sorts of the things that you'd expect in a log file. You know, you can do stack trace, execution stack, source. I'm just gonna pull this apart here. Let's say. So you can see it said execute anonymous apex. It did my lines, it allocated the heap. Here's the address variable. Here's my speaker name. Execute base class. So you can see there's a lot of information in the debug logs that you can use to debug. Here's all the addresses that was in my array. Here's my subject line. Here's where it's actually calling the system method to invoke the email service. And then finally, at the bottom, you get a rundown of all of these governor limits. How many of you are familiar with what a governor limit is, or what governor limits are? If you haven't heard about them, you'll hear them a lot. So, and Salesforce is a multi-tenant architecture, which means that we're all running in the same environment, actually. I can't see your data, you can't see my data, but we're all running on the same physical hardware in the Salesforce data centers. So what they do to make sure that you don't hog all the system resources is they do what's called governor limits. So you get this output here which says, you know, you can only do so many SOQL in one transaction. You can only do so many DML statements. You can only do so much CPU time in one transaction. They do this to make sure that they maintain the integrity for all the platforms. So this is something that's different than what you're probably used to with Java, in that in Java you're just like, okay, I have a heap size, I make sure that my heap is okay. If I'm not running out of memory in my heap, I have a number of threads, make sure that the number of threads is allocated right. You don't have to worry about threads and concurrency in Salesforce, which is awesome, but you have to worry about governor limits. So this is how you can look at the governor limits. And so finally, you can see that number of email invocations, 1 out of 10. So it did actually execute the email service. And if I check my email, did it come across? No. Interesting. It may be queued up. Yeah, it may just be in the queue. So we'll check back. Did anybody get the email already or no? You already got the email? Okay. I must be on a slow node. Okay, so that's good. So any questions around executing Apex anonymously in the email manager service? Sure. Correct. Correct. Excellent question. There is online documentation of all the libraries and classes that are available. So within the system namespace, so the way Salesforce doesn't have packaging like Java or .NET, but what it does have is what's called namespaces. And namespaces are similar in concept to a package, in that if you could look at here if you Google up the system Apex classes, these are all the Apex classes that are available to you out of the box. So you know, you have a number of, like a blob class for holding the data of a blob. If I scroll down, you have HTTP classes for doing callouts, JSON parsing. So this is where you would look at, the documentation is online to answer your question. And if I look for messaging here, where is it? Is it email? Messaging class, here we go. So this is the documentation on the class that we just used, right? So you could do reserve mass email capacity, send email, send a mass email, things like that. Does that answer your question? Cool. Great question. Any other questions on the email, on executing anonymous Apex or the email class that we just went over? Yeah. So Salesforce has 3 releases a year, and what they do is there's a couple different things about versioning. If you want to do version control with source code, you need to do that yourself and use either Git, Subversion, or another version tool. But there's another concept of your version of your code that runs in Salesforce. So if I'm looking at my Salesforce code here, for example, let's open up my Let's open up the class that we just created. So I double click on Email Manager. Notice in the upper right, there's an API version number right there. That's basically Winter 15. So you may know the releases as Winter 15 is coming, Summer 16. That all behind the scenes has an API version. And you can set your different classes to the different versions, and that basically gives you features. So each release, Salesforce gives you new Apex classes or new methods or new governor limits. And so you can take advantage of that by setting your API version to the newest version. But what they don't do is, if you do not manually update it, it will still continue to run. You don't have to upgrade your code. It'll still run with the next version. So you don't have to upgrade it right away if you don't want to, but if you want to take advantage of all those new features, you have to update your version. So that's two different ways to think about versioning, is the runtime and then storing your versions. Cool? Yes?
So who has access to this code? Only the person receiving a login or another developer?
No. So everybody who has access to this code is anybody to actually change and write the code, you have to have a permission on your profile called Customize Application. So anybody without that permission will not be able to change or write the code. But if anybody does have that permission, they can write and change the code. So that's one access layer, is people who can change the code. The second access layer is people who can access this code, like this Visualforce page or this Apex class. You have to give their profile permission to the Apex class, which we're not going to do that in this session because it's kind of a basics class, but that you can partition it to say, I don't want certain users to see this Apex class, and I want others to see this one. Does that answer your question? Okay. Cool. So, great questions. So, moving along. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go into step 3, which is using a static method. So a static method is just like you would think of it in like Java. It's not instantiated. You don't have to instantiate an object. So let's go back to our email manager class. And I am basically going to take this, copy it, paste it. I'm going to say public static void send email. And then I'm going to click OK. Click Save. I'm going to delete my other class. Mother method. Click File and click Save. Now I'm going to debug, open execute window. Now remember here, this line I had to instantiate this because it wasn't static. But now that it's static, I'm just going to call email manager, and I'm going to execute. How many of you are familiar with the difference between a static and a non-static variable? Okay, so basically a static means that basically when the runtime is accessible, you don't have to instantiate the value. It's once that class is referenced, it's in memory, and it's not going to basically change. So what you can do with a static, method is basically say, I don't want to instantiate the object. So for example, this email manager class, we're not persisting anything in memory. If you look at this class, it's a one transaction. It just takes in a few variables and spits out an email, and it doesn't do anything. So we're not holding state in memory about the email manager. So there's no real reason for us to consume memory and make something non-static. So if we make it static, we're saying just, let them do the email manager.send email. They don't have to maintain any state about the email manager and fire it off. So it's similar to in Java static or in other languages. So did everybody get the static one to work? That's a pretty easy one if you got the other one to work. Okay, so moving on, now we've seen basically what's a very simple Apex class and how we can use some of the built-in libraries to send an email. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do accessing data using SOQL and DML. So everybody following along okay? Pace okay? Too fast? Too slow? Okay. So SOQL is the Salesforce object query language. It's similar to SQL. So I'm going to switch back to my slide because I have some material on this to cover. Because it's very important. Let's see how we are doing on time. Time check. 1 hour in. Okay. And we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we'll probably be able to get to some of the more interesting things. So, accessing data with SOQL and DML. So, everybody here familiar with what with SQL? Who here knows SQL? Okay, a lot of you, right? So, I always like to say that SQL is just, or SOQL is just similar to SQL to make you frustrated. So, SOQL stands for the Salesforce Object Query Language. And it's similar to SQL, like I said, but it's not the same. It has streamlined syntax to traverse object relationships. It's built into Apex, and query results are returned as nested objects. So what does this mean? What this means is that, remember I said earlier that a little bit of the reasoning behind this, maybe in case you guys don't know. So again, I said Salesforce is a multi-tenant environment. So Coke and Pepsi are using the same hardware, right? And what they did is, the whole reason behind SOQL and Visualforce and Apex is, these are basically wrappers to solve the problem of multi-tenancy. So what this allows them to do is, with Apex, like Java code, there's no built-in mechanism to say, stop somebody from hogging the JVM resources. There's no mechanism built into SQL to say, I mean, you can do things like set constraints on users and things, but there's no built-in mechanism to necessarily restrain a multi-tenant environment. So Salesforce has, to open up that programmatic functionality, Salesforce gives us Visualforce, Apex, and SOQL. So in terms of SQL, what they've done is, if you think about it, if you're doing a huge complex join, that can really destroy your performance on your database. So what they've done is they've streamlined your SOQL calls so that you can't do complex joins across objects that aren't related. But what you can do is very easily is you can query related objects, and you can traverse the tree up and down objects. And because it's all built into the platform as S objects, your result set, instead of having to take your result set, throw it through an OR mapper, you just get the result set back. It's similar to, if you think about Hibernate, how Hibernate returns results. It's similar to that. So you don't have to do any marshalling or unmarshalling of your result sets, which is very, very handy. So a little bit about the syntax of SOQL. SOQL, it looks, this would be essentially select ID, name, phone from contact. As you would imagine, this has no filters on it. It's basically a dump of all of the records in the contact object. This looks exactly like SQL if you had a contact table with ID, name, and phone. So again, this looks similar enough. Okay, I'm comfortable. I know SQL. This looks good. Now I want to add a where clause. I want to add a filter clause. Okay, again, I know SQL. That's similar. Filtering. Phone not equal to no. Only give me the people who have a phone number. Again, I'm going to do a string, like and name like %row. So do a wildcard match on anybody who has rows in their name. Order by name. Again, I'm feeling pretty good. This all looks like SQL. I can do this. Limit 50. Again, cool. Okay, I only return me 50. Now we throw a monkey wrench in. So up until that point, it all looked like SQL and I was fine and dandy. Now I have this thing called account.name. I have a dot modifier in my field. What is this doing? This is what's doing what's called a parent query, or details to master. So how many of you are familiar with how the contact and account object are related? Okay. So the way Salesforce relates objects is through what's called lookup fields. And there's two types of lookup fields. There's what's called a master detail relationship, which basically requires that the child record have a parent. So you have to have a foreign key, essentially, on the child up to the parent. Or you have what's called a lookup relationship, which is basically it's the same thing. It's still a foreign key to the parent record, but it doesn't have to have a value. So it may be null, it may not be null. And what you can do with these lookup relationships is, if I have, for example, the contact is related to the account, and I have the foreign key is account, I can do account.name, and this will, in my result set, return the name of the account. So I don't have to do a join. This is essentially doing your join behind the scenes to pull in the name field from the account. I can also do a master to details. So from the parent, I can do basically a subquery. So I can say select name, select first name, last name, phone from contacts from account. So you can essentially do subqueries. and this will return, again, like I said, in the marshalling, you don't have to marshal it. When you do the S object, you'll have an S object, a field on your account called contacts, and it will basically be a list of contacts. So I'm going to pause right there because I'm going to show you how this works in the. Actually, I'm going to show you how this works in the developer console, and then we'll field some questions. Oops. Okay. So if I go back to my developer console, down here on the bottom, I have all these tabs. I'm going to select the query editor, and I'm going to expand this up a little bit. I say select ID name from contact. I'm going to say execute. The lower left. You can see I get my result sets here. All of my contacts. And you can do this yourselves too, because whenever you start up a developer edition org, Salesforce is nice enough to set up all the test data for you for a limited data set in a developer org. So if you execute this query in your own org, you'll get the results. Was everybody able to execute this SOQL query and get the result set? Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say select name, account.name from contact. I'm going to say execute. So here you see now it says Edge Communications, Burlington Textile, Pyramid. So here it's basically done essentially a parent-child relationship, or like what you could think of as kind of like a join. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do select ID name, select ID from contacts from account. 40. I'm going to go ahead and execute. And now you can see my result sets is I've got a name, ID, a name, and a list of contacts. And you can see there's all the IDs for all the different contacts underneath there. I can do things like, I could also do several queries in here. So I could also say select ID from opportunity. Opportunities. Yes. So you can do things like, I can do several subqueries in one SOQL query, which is very important because what you want to avoid doing in Salesforce is you don't want to do multiple SOQL statements. Again, going back to that concept of governor limits, a lot of times I'll see new developers, what they'll do is they'll say select ID from account in one query. And then the next query, they'll do a second SOQL query and let's say, from the list of accounts that I got in the previous step, get me all of the contacts. Well, what you could have done is just done one SOQL call and said, get me all the contacts and all the accounts in one SOQL, instead of using two SOQLs. So what that does is you can only do so many SOQL statements in one transaction. It's 100 for trigger and 200 for asynchronous. So those are like, I like to say like, I'm like Gollum. I'm like, don't use my SOQL statements. Like they're my precious. Like you have to make sure that people don't just willy-nilly start using all of your SOQL statements and triggers and code. So what I'll do is oftentimes I'll see this and I'll say, hey, did you think about doing the query with parent-child relationships or with query-children relationships? And they'll be like, oh, I didn't think about that. So my tip here is to think about one thing you might not do in Java is you might say, oh, why would I calculate something in memory when I could just do it in the database layer? Well, in Salesforce, you have to make a design decision. Is it going to tax me more for the governor limits, which I only have 100 of those? Or if I do the calculation in memory, I have 10 seconds of CPU time, which is a lot of time. Sometimes the trade-off is I'm not going to do all of it in a SOQL query. I'm going to do some of the calculations in memory, which you may have previously been using in your SQL statement. So there's a design trade-off. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we go back to our deck here, following along. So what you can also do is so I'm going to pause there. I'm going to ask any questions on SOQL before I move on from the demo. Yes? Yes. Yes. Yeah. So, if you think about it, when you iterate through a result set in like JDBC driver, for example, like a lot of times I'm parsing that into like an object model, and I have to parse that into an entity, right? What Salesforce does is the result sets it gets back already parses these into these S objects, which are first-class entities or classes. So in the next line of code, I'm going to show you how in Apex that works with the result set, so you can see what it does. But you're right, you're not going to get a flat. It allows you to do things like you can get parent and child. It gives you the entities back, not just a flat result set. Good question.
So I assume the social queries also occur on the libraries. So those would be counted against the.
It depends on, so I'm not quite sure the answer to that off the top of my head, because usually I haven't seen that impact my SOQL. But I will say that I do know that if you have namespaces, so if you install a managed package, for example, that executes in a separate namespace, which executes in another set of governor limits. So if you have, like, say you install an AppExchange product, and that has a trigger on account, and I wrote my own account trigger code, when you update an account, both of those triggers fire, and the SOQL for both of those gets executed. But I essentially have 100 queries here and 100 here. So you can have separate namespaces, which will have separate governor limits. In terms of the libraries that Salesforce has, I'm not sure off the top of my head how to answer that question, but I will tell you that separate namespaces will have separate governor limits. So I would assume anything that executes as a system level that needs to do SOQL, then it would execute in another namespace, I think. So hit up Twitter, ask for us after the session and ask, and we'll see if we can get an answer for that for you.
Yeah, the collections that come back, it looks like it's JSON format. Is it actually JSON?
So it looks like JSON formatted, but it's actually not. It looks like it, but you can use the JSON serializer class to serialize and deserialize the objects into JSON. So yeah, it's basically Salesforce abstracts them away. So in Java, for example, the reason it's showing up like this is in Java, there's a toString method. And you have to implement that toString method, right? So whenever I write a class in Java, I would say, again, this is based on top of Java, but it's similar to .NET. When I do toString out of the box on a Java object, I get back the reference ID, right? The memory location. If I want to actually return something human readable, I have to overwrite it. So Salesforce said, no one ever cares about the memory reference. They said, we're just going to default, whenever you do toString, return back all the field values. So that's where you're seeing it. It looks like JSON, but it's technically, I shouldn't answer this question because I'm not sure if it is or isn't, but I always just use the JSON serializer, deserializer. I use it all the time because I love JSON, and that gives me my results. Yeah.
Randomly, I noticed the sort of the built-in object. Account is singular, but contacts and opportunities is plural. Is there
Yes. Yeah, so these are what are called, this is a great question because it creates a lot of confusion. So those foreign keys, accounts and contacts, those are standard. There's two different types of objects in the platform, standard and custom, okay? The easiest way to know if you're a developer and you look at code, if I have __C or __ R, that means it's a custom, somebody created that, it's not out of the box. So out of the box, accounts and contacts are linked. So you see accounts is the link there from the child to the parent, account.name. And then from the child down, it was contacts. So you have to basically, can I get to that in this tool here? In the Eclipse IDE, when you browse the schema, you can show me what are the child and parent keys. Because like if I create a lookup relationship and I call it, here, let me just pull this up and show you. So if I did something like, say I wanted to do select ID, name from sessions. Is it sessions? Do they name it sessions? Oh, it doesn't like that session. Okay. So, and then if I said select ID from, what's the other one we had in here? How many of you used the schema builder before? All right, so this is a way that you can look at basically the ER diagram of your objects and your fields. And I'm going to do auto layout. It's a very handy tool for looking at your ER diagram. So if I'm doing a SOQL call, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll look in Schema Builder to see how the objects are related when I'm building my SOQL call. And here I can see session is linked to session speaker, speaker linked to session speaker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say select ID from session speakers. I think that will work. Let's see. Oh, oops. See, it'll say, see how it says it didn't understand the relationship session speakers? It's probably because I need to do an R. Yeah. So what you'll see a lot of times is underscore R means that that's a relationship. I want you to work on this relationship, a custom relationship. But when I did accounts and contacts, I just said account and contacts, right? I said accounts, contacts. That's the difference between custom and out of the box. So in the schema builder, I'm not sure how you do it in the developer console, but in like the Eclipse IDE, you can open up an object, and there's a file called. I'll just open it up here real quick for you, because this is important because it always confuses new developers. Is how do I query my custom relationships? This will run. But you can see how I did select ID from speakers, and that got me all the speakers that I created assigned to my tasks. All right. See how I have this file called package XML, or I'm sorry, schema, Salesforce.schema in the IDE. I can query and see all the field relationships in this tool, so it's pretty handy. So on the right, it's similar to the developer console, but for example, if I wanted to look at account, and it'll get the child, it gets the child and parent queries, and I can say the fields, here's all the fields, and I can say here's all my child relationships. So then I could say, like, I can let it build the query for me. So it's a handy tool if you want to do SOQL, if you want to use the Eclipse IDE, that's what I use. But the important thing I'm trying to show out to you is to show you, like, if I wanted to do the relationship name is child, this is where, that's the inner query, right? So that's how you could find out, if you needed to find out what the parent-child relationship is, you can use a tool like Schema Builder or this, the Eclipse IDE to figure that out.
So is there like, I mean, it seems like the relationship is defined by the pluralization of.
That's what, like 9 times out of 10, they can do that, unless somebody gets crazy. And then when you create the actual object, you can define what the child is labeled. But sometimes you get people that do it kind of crazy, so then you have to look in there and see. So again, as I was saying, inline SOQL, we can do inline SOQL in Apex. So if I want to basically do an aggregate SOQL query, so aggregate SOQL is something that you can do. I could say integer I equals select count from session. That's going to give me, that's going to return back an integer. And here I can say select string level advanced, and then I can do my list of sessions equals select name level from session where level equals input field of level. So when you do a colon like this, equals colon, that's going to bind it to the variable in your Apex code. So I have list of sessions, select name level from session where level equals my string level in my Apex code. And so now we're getting a little bit more advanced. So now I can do things like if I want to do an in clause, pass a list of values, I can say list string levels equals new list, levels.add intermediate, advanced, list session equals sessions, select name level from session where level is in levels. So I can also do in statements. And if we execute that, let's take a look at that. So I'm already doing, if I'm going to do is take this query, execute anonymous. I'm going to say list session, sessions equals, I'm going to open a bracket and close the bracket around the SOQL, and that defines the open and close brackets, defines your inline SOQL. And then I'm going to say something like, I'm going to say for session. sessions, system.debug. The developer console will give you the, as you type it out, it'll give you the methods that you can use. I'm going to say session dot name. And then I'm going to say execute. And then I'm going to say for, what's the other guy? Session speaker. So I'm going to say session speaker underscore C, the object, session dot. So again, to go back to answer your earlier question, it's not a flat result set. It's already parsed into the objects. I'm going to click execute. I'm going to click back on my logs tab. I'm going to double click on my log to bring that up. And here you can see that it executed my SOQL. And I iterated over my result set. And it printed out debug line. And I'm going to filter this to debug only. By clicking on, you can filter the logs by these little attributes down there. So I can say only show me my debug statements. Here I'm saying begin mobile development, and then it has one link of speaker info. Advanced programming, that has one link of speaker info. So the takeaway there is that I can do inline SOQL. I can do inline SOQL and parse my result sets easily. So I don't have to have like an object. I don't have to have ORM mapping files. I don't have to have Hibernate. I don't have to have a whole stack of translation files to build my entities from the objects. I can just do it right inline. Questions on that? Yeah. It'll be empty. It won't be null. So if I don't specify it in my select clause, it'll be empty. And what Salesforce will do then is if you try to do something with that field, it'll throw an exception. And it'll say, like, so if I said here, I tried to say, so I didn't query name, right? I only got the ID up here. If I try to do this, it should throw an exception. So Salesforce will say, if you don't query for that in your result set and you try to do something with that field, it'll throw an exception and say, you never got this field, so you can't do anything with it. Yeah. Yeah. No, it won't pull back the ID, but it'll pull back separate. So you'd have two speaker records with the same name but no ID, so you wouldn't be able to do much with that probably. Yeah, you won't be able to update it because it won't have an ID. So like if I did if I try to do something like, try to say, so let's say I only selected name from here. Let's try to do this. If I do update speaker, which you should never do this in a for loop, but just to show you. Did it pull back the ID? Interesting. I expected that to throw an exception. Huh. Maybe it pulls back. I don't think it pulls back the ID, because if I do the, interesting. I would have expected that to throw an exception, but my guidance would be always pull the ID regardless, because it'll just save you a headache. Good questions. Oh, you had a question? Yes. Good question. There is an offset. You can use offset to do pagination of search results. So using the offset clause, you could say, limit my result set to 100 records, and then do an offset. You could pass an offset parameter, and that's like your cursor, and it'll go to the next. You can use that to paginate your results. Because as you said, again, on my governor limits here, I have number of SOQL queries. I executed one SOQL query here. I got back 4 rows. And basically, and remember the rows, you're governed on the limit. So I can only get 50,000 results back in one Apex transaction. Executed 2 DML statements because I did the inner thing. But, so you do, it's a good question, is you do have pagination of results. And the way to do that is with the offset clause. So you can use this, the offset clause to basically build your pagination. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. I don't have an answer for that for you right now. That may be a little bit more complex than we can go over in this session. So hit me up on Twitter or after this session, and I'll try to answer the namespace question for you. Are you an ISV? Are you working with managed packages? Yeah. So again, we saw how I could do inner SOQL. I can parse the results in line. So again, I showed you, we also did this. We kind of skipped ahead. We did inlining SOQL and Apex. So I said I said select name, but you can do select email. So if everyone's following along, was everybody able to execute the SOQL who's following along? Were you able to get the query results back? Okay, good. So now we're going to talk about DML. So what is DML? Anyone here familiar with DML? In Oracle or other languages? Okay, so a DML statement, it stands for data manipulation language. It's a language used to create, update, and delete records. So basically it's CRUD operations. It's manipulating your data. And so if you wanted to insert a record, like I was saying, since it's a first class object, we can just create the S object in memory. So do session.name, session.level, and insert operation. So if we go ahead and do that in our sandbox, and I'm going to go open, execute anonymous window. What I'm going to do is before all this code, remove this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, before I do any of this, say session, insert session, equals new session. So I instantiate the S object. It has no ID. Insert session.name equals session test. Insert session.level _c equals advanced. Insert session. And then I'm going to say execute. And that executed. So if I do a lookup my debug logs, and I go all the way down to the bottom, I can see if I filter by debug only. Now you can see that it inserted the record of session test. So that's a simple insert. That's a simple insert DML statement. Now, let's say that I wanted to, let's see where the insert session. So I just showed you how you can do an insert session object. Now we may want to update a record, so you have to have the ID to update the record. So it's going to say select ID from session. I'm going to say update name. So from all of my queries, what I'm going to do is, in my SOQL, I'm going to remove this line. I'm going to iterate over all of my sessions that I got back in my result set from here. And I'm just going to say session.name equals session.name plus updated. And then outside of it, I'm going to say update sessions, and I'm going to execute. So the important thing to know is what you want to do with your DML statements is always bulkify, bulkify, bulkify. And by bulkify, remember earlier I said lists and sets and collections are your friends. So what you want to do is a DML statement, again, you get throttled. You have a DML governor limit, right? I can only do so many DML statements in one Apex transaction. But what I can do is I can update lists of records, collections of records. So here I just said all of in my result set in one DML, update all of the sessions. And if I go back and I look now in my org, go back to my sessions, you can see that they're all updated now. They all have the updated. I did a DML and I updated all of them. And you can do update operations and you can do delete operations. So create, update, and delete. So before I go on, I'm going to pause there. So are there any questions on the DML operations? No questions? Pretty cut and dry, right? The one thing I will say to do is to wrap your DML statements in try-catch blocks. That's not in the example here. That's kind of just some advice for you. And when you get out to actually writing your applications in the real world, you're going to want to try and catch those DML operations. Because what's going to happen is as you write trigger logic and as you extend your Salesforce org and your developers are putting validation rules on their objects, you may have code that's updating a record and then it all of a sudden starts failing because somebody said, do not update a session unless there's a time date associated with that session. And that would basically make your DML operation throw an exception and an error and say, this record you can't do this because this records needs this validation rule is failing. How many of you have seen the ugly red trigger message in your Salesforce orgs? Yeah. So basically what's happened is that code is basically just done a throw the exception of the error. And if people don't handle it right, you get the really nasty error, which is like this long 18-character red message, and like this means nothing to my users. So the proper way to do that is to use try-catch blocks and say try catch my DML operation, add error message to the S object, and then your end users won't get that nasty. They'll still get the red message saying contact name is required, but they won't get the huge stack trace of in account trigger handler, in contact trigger handler. They won't get that message. So always make sure to do try-catch blocks in your code. It'll save you a lot of headaches. And as developers, it should be familiar to in Java and .NET that you would write exception handling. So we're going to move on to SOQL, accessing data using SOQL and DML. So let's double check and make sure that we got through our guide. So we went over what SOQL is in DML. And now we're going to talk a little bit about, so we executed the update statement, we executed the insert statement. So before we move on, we're going to talk a little bit about SOQL. So how many of you are familiar with SOQL? We're not going to do a lab on it, but I just want to point it out, is you may come across something called SOQL, which is Salesforce Object Search Language. It basically does searching against strings in the database, so it's different than SOQL and it has its own set of limits. You can think of it as it basically can search through text throughout the entire org, so you could say, find me all of the, and it can search across multiple objects, which is really powerful. So you can say something like across accounts, contacts, opportunities, and my custom objects, find all of the records that have a string of Corey Cowgill in the name fields. And it can search in one query, it can search through the whole Salesforce org and return the results set. How many of you are familiar with the global search functionality? Okay, so under the covers, that's using SOQL, Salesforce Object Search Language. It's different than SOQL. You'll come across it if you're doing multiple object searches like that. So it's just something to be aware of. I don't want you guys to be confused. If you're like, what's SOQL, what's SOQL? We're only focusing on SOQL in here, but that's just a little hint so that you don't get confused later on. So was everybody following along and able to execute the SOQL and DML? Anyone not able to do it that was struggling? Okay. If not, we'll move on to writing triggers. So what is a trigger? How many of you are familiar with a SQL trigger on a table? Okay, this is basically the same thing. For those of you who are not familiar with what a trigger is, it's code that's executed in the database layer. So what that means is regardless of where the data is getting updated from, whether it's a mobile app, whether it's a desktop UI, whether it's an integration from a third-party system and an API call, this business logic will fire. And there's different, when an object is updated, multiple things happen. And this is called the trigger order of execution. So you have these what are called trigger context variables, or your trigger context. So what we have is we have a before or after call. So here's all of our DML statements, right? Insert, update, delete, and undelete. We didn't go over that, but you can undelete records. So you have all these are basically the different operations that can be performed. And then you also have a timing, which is either before the update or after the update, okay? So you can think of it as, what happens before the record is updated? Well, I may want to validate something. You're inserting, before inserting a contact, make sure that the contact email has a value. So that means before it's actually saved in the database, while it's still in memory, check to see if it's valid to be saved in the database. You can do dedupe checkings. Do a SOQL query to see, is there another Corey Cowgill in the database? If there is, throw an exception. The thing about before triggers is there's no ID assigned yet, right? So if you have an ID, for example, on an insert call. On an insert call, you don't have an ID yet. So a lot of times, some things you may not be able to do in a before trigger. If you don't have the ID and you want to link it to something, you can't do that till an after trigger. So an after trigger fires after the record has been persisted to the database. I shouldn't say it's been persisted to the database. This record is in memory, and Salesforce has allocated an ID to that record, and all of the before logic is fired. So what that means is it's in memory. It has an 18-character Salesforce ID, but it's not physically persisted in the database yet. Because now it's going to do some things after the update, right? So now you may want to do things like, once the record's inserted in the database and I have an ID for it, link it to something else. Like take that ID and link it to child objects, or do some calculations and put that on another object that's related to it. You may want to do something like, now that I have the ID and I can have a URL, like I showed you earlier, the URL at the top, the 18-character ID, send them an email with a hyperlink to their record in the system. That's how you got your session emails. That's when you click the link. So I'm going to pause there. And there's a whole, if you want to look at it, for those interested in doing the advanced dev certification, there is this whole thing about Apex order of execution. So what happens is, this is the guide to show you what happens when a database record is saved. Because not only do we have the before and after triggers, like I said, in those operations, but when do the validation rules fire? When do the workflow rules fire? This documentation will explain to you exactly how your trigger logic works and all the order of operations of everything in Salesforce. Because remember, we have people doing stuff in the programmatic layer, building workflows and validation rules, which can impact our trigger code, and vice versa. So this is the Bible in terms of, when I do this, this is how all of the before triggers fire, all of the validation rule fire, all of the after triggers fire. And you can see there's about 20 steps in there's There's about 20 steps in the flow. So this is important to know when you get out in the real world, and I've referenced this millions of times, especially with new developers. Like, okay, like they'll be saying like, well, I updated the contact record and the trigger fired. I saw that my trigger fired, and my trigger code, my debug statement said that it added the phone number, and I'm like, is there a workflow rule or something else firing? And then sure enough, there's a workflow rule firing that was overriding his trigger. So knowing the order of execution is really important when you get out into production and you're working back at your office. So I'm going to pause there. Is there any questions about trigger context variables and order of execution? Yes. Yeah, you first.
So I've seen a lot of stuff saying never know when you're going to be fired. Is that just sort of an edible rule, or I mean, I'm going to read that, but
Yeah, you're going to read that. So I know exactly what you're asking. You're asking is what the best practices. Also, I want to, if for no other takeaway from this class you get is always use Apex separation of concerns, and use your object-oriented programming knowledge, and only make one trigger on each object. And by that, what I mean is, what I can do is I can create multiple triggers for an object. I can say trigger on delete, two separate triggers created on that same on delete operation. And then Salesforce, I can't control when those triggers fire. But if I create one trigger and I use what's called the Apex trigger handler pattern, and I abstract all of my business logic away from the trigger, then all of my trigger says is if is trigger is after, if is before, do this. And then I can control my order on my trigger. But if I have multiple triggers on one object, I can't control the flow. And then what you get is you get scenarios where I have a complex Apex transaction, data is getting overwritten and I can't control it. And you get, if you're in a large enterprise environment, your logic is, you're in like a quagmire. So always use the trigger handler pattern, abstract all your business logic. Never, if you ever see people write logic inside their triggers, you're going to see some trigger logic written here for the tutorial. But in real life, do not write trigger logic. Do not write your business logic in a trigger, please. Save yourself the headache.
So one of those examples you mentioned the way from using trigger in a normal database, typically just do a constraint on the table, like checking that there is no duplicates and adjustments and unique and things like that. Do you have the ability to add constraints on your schema?
Yes. Yes, so you can do things like if I can add what's called an external ID field, that's a unique field. So then if I try to add two records with an external ID of Corey, for example, it would fail. It's a constraint. I can also do things like require the field, make the field required in the clicks. So we didn't do that again. There's a lot of the clicks, not code, that can be done to add constraints. But I think the great use case for when you want to do a trigger to do a constraint is when you have to do logic across multiple objects to find out some complex logic where they can't do it in clicks. Then you're going to want to write a trigger to do that constraint. So you can do a lot of constraints with just clicks, but Apex is really all about doing. My analogy is always like when you get Salesforce, you get a Lamborghini, but your admins are only driving at like 60 miles an hour, right, on the highway. With Apex Visualforce, you can make that thing go like 200 miles an hour. So when you need to do everything under the sun, you can do it in Apex and Visualforce. Does that answer your question? Good questions. Anyone? Yep.
Is there a best practice for thinking of order of operations with managed packages and your own triggers and stuff that you're developing?
Yeah.
The standards that the managed package just can't mess up your order of operations. How does that?
Well, again, so if you install a managed package, what it's going to do is it's going to install another trigger on your account object, and you can't control which one fires on which case. So what you have to do is, depending on what the managed package does, you have to do a lot of testing and you can use static variables to manage recursive trigger firing and things like that, but that's kind of a different beast. So my recommendation is if you do the Apex trigger handler pattern, you can at least make sure that your logic is controlled, and then you have to test it with the managed package. It's not an exact science when you get into the managed packages because they can overlay your business logic. Good question, though. Okay. So as I was saying, you want to make sure that you bulkify all of your code. So the Trigger API is built to do bulk operations. So it passes in records in a result set of 200 records at a time. Again, because it's multi-tenant and they want to make sure that everything is as efficient as possible. So triggers work on bulk of records, not just single records. So a lot of times I see on the developer boards or a question, I see a trigger handler, and or not even in the trigger handler, I'm sorry, inside the trigger I see trigger 0 index dot name, and they access the variable right there as just one. All triggers fire in bulk on multiple records at a time. So there may only be one record if you're doing it on a page update. You say just update the one record, but you have to code as if there's going to be multiple records, or bulkify your code is what it's called. So the context variables you get are trigger.old and trigger.new. Those give you a list of all the records. And then you also get trigger.oldMap and trigger.newMap. So again, if you do a trigger.new, it's not going to have the ID. So for example, in a insert operation. But if you're doing an update operation or a delete operation, you're going to get the trigger.oldMap, trigger.newMap, which is going to have your IDs. So I always use the maps as much as possible, because then you can iterate over and match up on the IDs. So for example, now again, in real life, what I would do is for this use case, all of that logic would be inside of a business object, Apex class. I would never put this in the trigger. But for the example, for this class, to make it simple for you guys, we've put the business logic inside of the trigger. So this is an example of a trigger welcome kit on account after insert. And it says, what I want to do is create a list of cases. And for every single account that's inserted, what I want to do is I want to create a case, a welcome case. And it's saying, for all of the accounts in the trigger, trigger.new, create a case. And because it's on the after insert, I have the ID, and it's using account.id there. And then it's inserting the cases. So that's just a simple use case of, a lot of times what you want to do is when you create a record, you want it to create some other records. And that's an example of how you can do that. You can't do that with workflows. So that's a typical use case of when you want to do a trigger is, I need to do something with children records or cross different objects, and I need to do complex business logic, and this is how you do it. This is an example of a constraint. So for account, trigger.new. Now this particular example, to your point, could have been done in clicks. They could have done a validation rule. They don't have to do this in a trigger, but we're keeping it simple. So we're saying, before the update occurs, iterate over all of my accounts. And if the rating on the account is different, if somebody changed the record rating, we may want to stop them from doing that. So you could add custom business logic into that. Which gets to my other point of, what's the difference between a workflow and a trigger? A workflow is with clicks. Again, you can do, as I said, you can do update field, send an email, create a task. You can do a lot. You can even send outbound messages. You can send a SOAP. You can send an outbound SOAP message. And you can also launch a visual flow page, a visual flow wizard. They can do that with the workflow. Across objects, they can update fields, but only one layer and only from the parent, only from the child to the master in a master detail relationship. With a trigger, you can pretty much do anything. You can update, delete. You can call out with REST calls. You can launch asynchronous processes. It's pretty much, you can update any object in the system if you want to. You can do SOQL, anything you can get reference to, you can do. So triggers really open up the world of really complex business logic. So in general, the practice is, what can I do with clicks, not code, in general, but that's not always the Bible. Sometimes it may actually be easier to do it in a trigger. So my example is, I have developers, I have a large enterprise org that I'm the architect for, and what we do is, I give my BAs the guidance of, in general, you need to do it with clicks if you can. However, you need to think about it in real world. Think about like, well, yeah, I can do this with a workflow, but I'll have to do 50 workflows to make this business process work, 50. And then, well, I could do that in 2 lines of Apex code, which is easier to maintain at that point. 50 clicks, 50 workflow rules, which takes up my workflow governor limit, or 2 lines of Apex code. So that's why I say it's not the Bible in terms of like clicks, not code. It's not the Bible. Sometimes there are trade-offs in terms of maintainability, simplicity, but in general, that's what you want to try to do with clicks, not code. But when you want to do code, you can pretty much do anything, which is awesome. So we're gonna do the next lab, which is we're gonna write our own triggers. So I'm gonna go in here, and let's go to the next. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a trigger that sends confirmation emails. So we already created an email handler, right? So now we're gonna reuse that class and send out trigger emails. So I'm gonna create a new trigger on the session speaker object. So I'm going to go up here, I'm going to say File, New, Apex Trigger, and I'm going to call this. So what I always call this, also a lot of times I see this, I always try to implement standard naming. So I always name my trigger S-object name, trigger. A lot of times I see people name things like, especially people who decide to put multiple triggers on an object, I see people say like, account business process A trigger, account business process B trigger, and I'm like, no, one trigger, just put all that logic in a trigger handler class. So I always name mine just the S object name, because then it shows up real nice and clean in the trigger list of like, now I know it's a one-to-one mapping between my objects and my triggers. So we're going to call this one, what's this, a trigger on the session object. Session speaker. So I'm going to say session speaker trigger. And then I'm going to pick my object, session speaker. I'm going to click submit. And so by default, it creates a trigger for me. It says before insert. And what I always do is, I only want one trigger on each object, so I always say before update, before delete, after insert, after update, after, I don't think there's an after delete. No. Did I get the right context variables there? Yeah. So this is how you make sure that you only have one trigger. I make sure that the different CRUD operations are in my trigger method, my trigger definition. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, I say if trigger, then I say if trigger dot is after. This is a little bit different than the guide, but this is how you'd want to do it in production. And then I'm going to say if trigger dot is insert. Then I would do my business logic here, my trigger handler, but for the example, we'll just cut and paste this code here. Okay. Everybody see that okay? And then, did I get that right? All my stuff match up? No. Okay. Now my brackets may be off. That's going to drive me nuts. Okay. So I click File, Save. So now what will happen is whenever I insert a new record, this is going to fire. So everybody able to copy the code into their developer? You have a question? After insert? Did I say if trigger is after, if trigger dot is insert? And did I, up the top, did I said after insert DML operation? So that should be good. It compiled. What's your question exactly?
No, I didn't see the after insert.
Yeah. So what I do is, in real life, what I do is I keep my triggers are only about 20 lines of code, and all the business logic will be a trigger handler. And I always just say, if trigger dot is before, and then I do if trigger is insert, if trigger is delete, and then I route that logic to the domain classes, the business classes. But for this example, we're just going to do it inline. So if the trigger is after and it's an insert, we're going to iterate over all of the trigger.new and we're going to create, what are we going to do here? Send confirmation email for the speaker's address. Okay, so this will fire on an insert. So what I can do is we can open up our debugger now. I'm going to say, actually, I don't think, what do they want us to do here? The trigger takes effect as soon as you save it. So now any records that we save, this trigger will fire. So what we can do is we can go back into our UI. I'm going to say new session speaker. And I'm going to give it to Steve Jobs. And now when I click the save button here, this trigger is going to fire. And it's going to send out an email. So I clicked save. When I saved it, the trigger should have fired, and I should get an email. Everybody able to save their trigger successfully? Everybody able to add a record and let it fire? And did anyone get the email yet? You got the email already from the trigger? Okay. Here we go. So here's my trigger. Ah, great. Always be checking for nulls, by the way. Your session test updated on null is confirmed. So that's because I didn't put in a date and time on that record, so it came back as null. So always be checking for nulls, as I always like to joke. So let's go back to our tutorial. So we're on step 2. We can also create a trigger that rejects double bookings. So was there a question? Yeah. Okay. Yes, you need to do this, and here's why you need to do it. It's an excellent question. Here's why you need to do it. Because when I insert a record in Salesforce, I have to query to get the parent-child relationships. So it's a good question in that when you get a trigger in these context variables in trigger.new, it will only have the records at that level of the object. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to get the speaker's email address, right? So I have to do a join basically, or what's called a parent-child relationship. So you won't get those in a trigger. Out of the box, it's basically like, here's the updated values on this object. If you want to go up or down in the tree, you have to query for it. So that's why we do a SOQL query here to get the related values. Now, I will tell you a hint that you can do here to save yourself some grief. Formula fields will be passed into the trigger. So in a formula field, I can actually do some of the same things I can do here. So what I could have done is I could have told my BA, give me formula fields for speaker name, speaker session date, speaker first name and speaker last name, and speaker email on my object. Give me formula fields on the session speaker object for those values. And then in my trigger, I wouldn't have to do a SOQL, because in the trigger, it would be the formula field will be in there, because formula fields are calculated whenever you look at the record. So then you wouldn't even have to do this SOQL. You could save yourself a SOQL. Does that make sense? So you can use formula fields to basically make your SOQL life easier in your triggers, which can improve performance. So that's one thing to think about. Because then because SOQL, again, SOQL, my precious, my golem, like I don't want people to do SOQL unless I have to. If you do formula fields, you don't have to do a SOQL call. And that'll save you, because if you're doing a large enterprise deployment like I am, and I have 20 lines of business using the account object, I need to make sure people don't consume all my SOQL. So that's a very good question. Any other questions? Okay, go back to our guide. So what we can do here is we can also make sure that we're rejecting double bookings. So on our trigger, on the session speaker again, what we're going to do is we're going to say, select ID, so we're going to say retrieve session information, including session time and date. And we are going to say, I'm going to do a double check here, so let's see here. I'm going to go against my own good advice because the tutorial is just written like that. I'm going to create a new trigger. Again, I would never do this in production, but for the example, we'll do it. Reject double booking. So I'm going to create a duplicate trigger on the same object, call it reject double booking, paste it, file save. And now what will happen is if I try to double book the speaker with the same date time, it should fail. Which means I have to give this a date time. Okay. And let's say I try to add Steve Jobs again. Then I get the red message saying error, invalid data. Review all error messages below to correct your data. The speaker is already booked at this time. So what happened was on the trigger, before it inserted the record or before it updated it, it did a SOQL query to say, give me all the date times from the session. For this session, get me all, or for this speaker, get me all of his sessions. And then if he has any sessions which have the same date and time, add it to this conflicts result. And then you can use the add error method to add an error to an S object. So in this case, I'm not throwing an exception because S objects, again, are special objects like I was saying earlier. And if you do add error, in a trigger, it'll add that error message to the error in the screen. Yes?
When we were executing code, we could see the execution track stack. Is there anything to see the execution of a trigger?
Yes, you can see in the debug statements, you can see the execution of you'll see the code. So where's this at? So if you load up the log file, so the way to think about an Apex transaction, or a Salesforce transaction, I should say, is it's going to have all of your logs from your Apex code, your workflow rules, your field validations, all of that will be in the log files. So here what I can look at is it says, you click the save button, so the transaction started, and you can see the first thing that happened was the session speaker trigger fired, and it fired on before insert. And then it goes through, so this is actually in the trigger code unit, it's trigger, but it's code. It says the trigger fired on this event. And then if you go down, it says, I also fired the reject double booking trigger on before insert, right? So I can't control whether this one or the other one fires first because I created two triggers on the same object, which is why you don't want to do that. But for this example, you can see that I have two triggers, both are firing on before insert, right? So you can see how that could be a problem if I had logic that contradicted each other in those. So that's why I only want to do one trigger. But for the tutorial today, we're going to break the rules to make it simple. But yeah, you can see all that stuff. I can see my list that came back in the trigger. Now, what I don't have in this org is I don't have validation rules and I don't have workflow rules. But if I did, they would show up here also, and it would say workflow rule validated said it would update to true. Validation rule name is equal to greater than 10 characters is true. So you can get a log of all the clicks things that people do also. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And that would help validate. You can see that executes before this, before this. Good question. Any other questions as we're moving along?
So normally you put all that in one trigger?
Yeah, so I'll pull up some code that I did on another project. I'll show you in a real world example. A real world example may look like this. So I have a trigger here where it's basically on all of the different all of the different DML operations. You can see I commented this for my junior developers. So if you attempt to press 2 circle timeout. Oh, so here I have a, this is a complicated trigger. It's doing processing account sharing rules. So I'm forcing people to say only do 10 records because it's a time sensitive transaction. But you can see the pattern here is what we did is we said one trigger on this object, and I have is after, is before, is insert, and then I have a static variable to control recursive trigger firing, and then all of my business logic is inside of these trigger handler classes. So you can see this trigger is only 30 lines of code, and it doesn't have any business logic in it. All it does is it routes the logic to what business classes need to do the logic. And you may be asking yourself, what's this trigger handler TPR, this static variable I have here? It prevents recursive firing. So another real world example is that, say I have a trigger, and that trigger says when an account is updated, I want you to update the contacts to say the contact status is send them an email. Send them a notification that we updated their account. Well, then I might have a trigger on the contact which says when the contact is updated, fire logic to update the account to say, I have 10 contacts, for example. Well, then that fires a recursive loop, right? So then I get, now my account's saying, okay, I just got updated, update all the contacts, and then I'm in a recursive loop, right? And what happens is Salesforce will kill you, and it'll say, you've done more than 16 recursive calls, you're in an infinite loop, I'm going to kill your whole transaction. So what we do is, using and this is another reason why you want to use the trigger handler pattern, is using the trigger handler pattern, I can set a static variable on my trigger handler to say, this business logic is already executed. Don't recursively trigger this guy. So you want to use, that's what that's doing there. But you can see that all of my method is doing is it's just taking in maps and collections. Trigger.new map, trigger.old map, trigger.new map. Because these are all after operations. But if I was doing a before, I would do something similar. And if I look at this other trigger, you can see this is another trigger, another custom object, which is streamlined again. So this is how you'd want your triggers to look like. This is production. You don't want them to look like, I'll show you an example. You do not want them to look like no, this is good. Do I have a bad example? Like this is not a good, this is an example of how you would not want to do the trigger because it says it's a duplicate trigger. It's not associated entitlement. That's not, this really is firing on the case. So I'd expect there to be one case trigger. And then you see all this logic that is in here that is business. This is all business logic that's inside the trigger. Like that's not how you'd want to do it. So, because I have another case trigger here, which is clean, which says, but now I have two, see how I have two triggers there and I have to debug that? This is how you'd want it to be. You want it to be nice and clean. You don't want it to be multiple triggers on the same object. Does that make sense? Is it valuable? Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's a business logic. Yeah, you create another object, a domain. Like if it was Java, it'd be like a domain class, or like you're saying, like it's a separate method that encapsulates all that business logic. Because what may happen is, just like object-oriented programming, I may want to invoke not in a trigger. Maybe I want to do this in the UI. Maybe I want to do it in a batch process that's not necessarily in the trigger. Sometimes I may run into limitations on a trigger where I'm running out of governor limits in a trigger and I can't do this business logic in a trigger. But I can do it in a batch apex because batch apex gives me double the governor limits. So I can do it asynchronously, but I can't do it synchronously. But I don't want to write duplicate code everywhere. So if you abstract it away into these domain objects and use the trigger handler pattern, you'll be able to do that and reuse your business logic. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Good questions. So we're running, we got about 30 minutes left. So we're going to go into Visualforce, which is the last section of this. So what we've done so far is we've looked at building Apex classes, triggers, and using the email handler class, using SOQL to query our data in the back end. So all of that can be used with the standard Salesforce detail pages like we've seen so far. So we haven't built a rich user interface yet. So Visualforce Pages allow us to do that. So what is a Visualforce page? A Visualforce page is basically, it's HTML tags executed at the server side to generate dynamic content. It's similar to JSP, JSF, and ASP. So you can do a lot of things, like you can use jQuery in it. Anything you can do with HTML, you can pretty much do in Visualforce, because at the end of the day, it renders into HTML. It's the view in the MVC model. How many of you here are familiar with the MVC model? Okay. So what the MVC model is, it's a way of application architecture. It's been around for a real long time. It's a way of you can decouple your logic from the different parts of an application. So you can think of the view as basically the web page or the user interface code. It's either your mobile screen or it's the screen on your desktop browser. So it's all logic around. That's where you put the logic to say, well, when they select this dropdown, do something else on another dropdown. Filter this list of dropdowns. When they click on the next button, I want it to show a spin wheel or things like that. So you don't really want to do your no data access code in the view. So you don't want to directly code the view logic in your view layer. And I will say the one caveat on this model view controller paradigm is with JavaScript, you can still do the model. There's a lot of things called one-page apps now, and a lot of people are building apps strictly in JavaScript, which is really cool. But this paradigm can still apply. The only difference is that your controller layer is then in JavaScript, like with one of the JavaScript frameworks that does that. So even if all your logic is inside of a Visualforce page in a one app application, you can still do MVC architecture with the way you build your methods and your JavaScript objects. But the way that Visualforce Apex works is the view layer is your Visualforce page. Your controller is your Apex class. A controller basically has the logic to say, call this, go to this page, go to that page, query this data, display this data, and send it back to the Visualforce page. And then the model layer is what we've been playing with, is like, the triggers on the objects, my validation rules, things like that, my fields, my relationships. So again, just to reinforce it, the view, metadata, standard pages, Visualforce pages, external apps. Your controller is in the metadata, standard controllers, custom controllers, controller extensions, and then you have the model, which is metadata, objects, triggers, and classes, which we've already played with a lot so far. So the one thing to take away from this is, we'll get to it, is there's two different types of controllers or extensions, and we'll get to that in a second. So when you build a Visualforce page, how many of you have done either ASP pages or JSF pages, and you know about expression binding? Okay. If you're not familiar with it, basically what happens is the server I can bind using expressions to bind to values in my controller, and I can bind values and formulas. So anything inside of a bracket, exclamation point, close bracket, Salesforce, when it renders the page, when it renders the HTML, it will inject your values from your controller inside there. So you can do dynamic variables, and I could say contact.phone or .myApex variable, something on my controller that's accessible. I can add logic to my view layer if I needed to, so I can say if the opportunity stage is closed one, display or not display. And I can do functions. I could say JS encode account.billing address, encode these values for different things. The $, if you can do $, you can access what's called global variables, or variables that are accessible throughout the application. Remember earlier we had public class. You can also create global classes. And there's also things that are global that are just out of the box. So for example, $, username, you can get the logged in user's name, profile, their email address, things like that. So the $, gives access to what's called global variables. And it'll make more sense. I'll pause for questions after we go through a few examples so you can wrap your heads around it. So basically the most simple Visualforce page you can create is the hello world, hello page example. So I'll go into my developer console. We can all go into our developer console. Let's create file, new, Visualforce page. I'm going to call this hello world, because we're all developers here. We all love the good old hello world. I'm going to say Apex. So Visualforce pages have their own tag library, and they start with Apex. Say Apex. I'm going to say output text. And I'm going to say value equals, I'm going to do my brackets, an expression, $, user dot first name, file, save. Compiled cleanly, it's saved, okay. So now what I can do is, the quickest way to get to a Visualforce page, for those of you who don't know, is you can use the URL at the top. And one way you can always tell if a page is an Apex page is Apex in the URL. It'll be Apex/Apex and then slash the page name. So I said hello world. And that will take you directly to your Visualforce page. And I apparently forgot to close that bracket. Too many brackets. Output text value equals your profile ID is, and then I can say $, user.profile. Is it profile or profile ID? We'll see here in a second. I may not like that. Oh, problems. Okay, I didn't like that. Could not find profile. Okay, so it must be profile ID. There we go. So you can see, I can do your query. Your profile ID is the ID of your profile. So you can bind to. Those are both global variables. Okay. But notice our controller. We don't have a controller. I don't have a controller. I don't have any Apex classes or anything in here. It's just accessing some global variables. So remember, I said that every object in the system every object in the system that you create is a first-class object. So I get all those S objects behind the scenes when I did my queries. Well, it's also every object has a controller, out-of-the-box controller, that does the save, update, delete operations. So if I do Apex standard controller equals contact, I can create a form to actually update the values, because this is a standard, part of what's called a standard controller. So if we do that, we can do that quickly in our prototype and just say, whoops. You can say Visualforce page, standard controller equals contact. I'm going to leave my hello world stuff up there, Apex form. And then I'm going to say Apex input text, value equals email. And actually, I'm going to say input field. I'm going to say Apex output text, value equals name. Say output field, sorry. Whoops. And I'm going to bind it to the contact dot name. And I'm going to say bind this to the contact dot email. I'm going to say Apex command button, value equals save, action equals save. So I'm doing a couple things here, if this compiles. So what I've done is I've created a Apex controller, and it's bound to a contact. Now, what I can do is I can say, when you do a standard controller, one of the hints is that I can do question mark, pass in a parameter, ID equals the contact ID. So remember I said that IDs are like the links in the URL that you can use. So following along, I can pull a contact. All contacts, give me this guy, I don't care which one. Copy this ID. In a standard controller, I'm always going to have this, I can always pass in the ID in a standard controller. That tells it what's the ID of the object. And if I pass that ID along to my standard controller, it's going to basically pull in that object and on the fields that I'm referencing. So you can see here that I overwrote this. I have a standard controller for contact, which means that if I pass in an ID to this page, it's going to pull in all the contact fields that I'm referencing. And here I'm referencing the contact name and the contact email. So that's displaying, I should probably do a BR here, huh? So it's clean. So it's basically giving me a contact name, contact email, and then I have an action save. So you can see I passed in the ID. You pass in this is in the documentation, by the way, but this trick is you always put the ID equals and then it's going to pass it into the controller. So now what I can do is I'm going to update this guy's email and I'm going to say the value is corey.cowgill@gmail.com. I'm going to say save. Oops, I refreshed. I saved the page while I was updating it. I'm going to click save. So that saved the record, the out-of-the-box fired, and you can see here that it automatically rerouted me back to the standard page view, and it updated the record with my email address. I didn't write very much code to do that. That's out of the box. That's what a standard controller does. You get save, delete, update. It'll work just like you did from the standard button if I'd clicked edit and save. So the default out-of-the-box behavior is to route you back to the view page. So you get a lot of functionality. You can do a lot with a Visualforce page without having to write any Apex code. So that's the takeaway I want you to see there, is that I could write a Visualforce page without any Apex code. But that's not any fun, right? So a lot of times what we may want to do is we may want to change the page that they go to. So when they save a contact, send them back to the account. Or when they save the contact, do a duplicate check instead of the trigger. Because sometimes you may want logic to only execute in the Visualforce page and not at the trigger for all people. So to go over this, a standard controller, it's available for all of your objects. You don't have to write any Apex code. There's no test methods needed. You can grab a single or a set of records. It provides basic CRUD access, create, update, delete, field access, etc. And it uses the ID query string parameter and the URL to access the object. So remember I showed you, that's how I put that ID, question mark ID equals the 18-character ID. That's how you get the URL to the object. So the presentation tags, again, Apex has its own tag library, which you don't have to use, but I recommend you use it because it does a lot of work for you. It'll render all your pages, the styling, the CSS. It'll make it look and feel like a native Salesforce page. So a lot of times I get developers who just start injecting HTML code directly into a page, and then it looks wonky when somebody's working in Salesforce, and they want it to look and feel just like Salesforce. So don't reinvent the wheel unless you have to. So I always recommend to use all the Visualforce tag libraries. Because you also get another benefit that if you use all the Apex tag libraries, you'll get the support of Salesforce says this browser supports Internet Explorer 7, 8, 9, 10, Chrome, blah, blah, blah. If you use the Visualforce tag library, those are supported by those browsers. That's how they test it. If you do your own HTML and your own CSS, then it's up to you to make sure that, oh, my browser supports this. Because all of the tag libraries from Salesforce will support whatever the Salesforce browsers are supported. Again, because you don't want to get into the game of managing people's browsers and things. You can get fine-grained data tags like I showed you, contact first name, last name, email. If you use the Apex input field, you don't have to render controls. So an Apex input field will dynamically drive what type of control to render. Again, you can use Apex Detail, Apex Page Block, that formats your page to look like the standard page. And you can do the standard ways. So does that kind of make sense so far? Tag libraries. It's similar to JSF has its own tag libraries. ASP has its own tag libraries that will render the controls for you. So the takeaway here is that don't reinvent the wheel. I'm going to skip over this section because we don't have a lot of time. But what I will say is that you can build JavaScript apps very easily on the platform, mobile apps, using the Visualforce. But I want to get to because we have about 20 minutes left. This is the final lab, which is writing a Visualforce page, so I want to get to this. So we're going to write a form page for the speaker form, and we're going to set it as the default for creating and editing speakers. So what is a controller extension? So remember I just told you that you don't have to do anything with an Apex Visualforce page to get it to work. You can just basically build your own custom classes. Excuse me, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is, I showed you on a Visualforce page we didn't have to do a controller. Every object has a controller out of the box. But you can also create custom controllers or extensions. An extension is basically like it's a controller that also executes alongside the standard. So it works the same as the object as a standard controller. You can overwrite the standard controller behavior, and you can add new capabilities. So to do this, you use the extensions tag or attribute in the Apex page. We say extensions equals speaker 2.3. So you can add multiple extensions to a page. And then you can bind to attributes in those Apex classes. So for example, we have a public class speaker controller extension. It has a private variable of speaker, a private of standard controller, and then it has some methods for overriding custom methods. And it has a constructor. See that constructor there? Where it says public speaker controller, Apex Pages.standard controller. That allows you to overwrite a page. This is the key to saying, if you have an Apex class and it says Apex Pages.standard controller, that's going to let you use that controller in a Visualforce page to override a standard page. So what is a custom controller? It's a custom class written in Apex. It doesn't have to work on a specific object. It provides custom data and behavior. But before we move on, we need to go back to our guide. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So let's go back to our workbook. Let's go back into our next page. So we already did the creating of it. If you didn't do this one, this is the one I kind of walked you through where, oh, I'm sorry, no. This is the one we're on. Create the speaker form Visualforce page. Okay. So what I want everybody to do is go in your developer console and create this Visualforce page. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this code. Go into my console here. File and save. I'm going to say file, save it, or do I want to do, I'm going to create a brand new page. So file, new, Visualforce page. Enter in the title, speaker override. Say file, save. Now note that we have here a standard controller of speaker in this Visualforce page. This is going to let us overwrite the standard page. So if you've ever wondered, how do I override a standard detail screen or a standard edit screen with a Visualforce page? How do I overwrite the standard behavior? This is how you do it. Because when I say standard controller equals the S object, it's going to open up that option in the setup. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go into setup. I'm going to say objects. So in my setup menu, I'm going to go to my objects, navigate to the object. I'm going to go to my speaker object here. I'm going to scroll down, and there's a section called Buttons, Links, and Actions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, for the edit screen, I'm going to override this. See, I clicked edit there, and now it asks me, what do you want to override it with? I say, I want to override it with the speaker override Visualforce page that I created. I'm going to click save. So everybody able to follow along and do that? Yeah. So yeah, that was a little fast, sorry. All right. So what I do is I go from setup in the upper right. I do a quick find on my object to say object. This will filter. This is a great tool. It'll filter all your options. And I go to objects. And once I'm on the objects screen, here's all my custom objects that I've created. And I'm going to click on my speaker object because that's the Visualforce page we want to override it with. And then now I have all the options for the custom object. I'm going to scroll down to this section that says buttons, links, and actions. This is the standard Salesforce behavior. And what I'm going to do is you click edit next to the action. So whenever somebody edits this record, I want them, when they click that edit button, take them to this Visualforce page. And then I say override it with my Visualforce page. You should get the option to Visualforce page. So now what happens is if I go to a speaker record, so let's go to Bill Gates or someone, Steve Jobs. Now when I click this edit button, it should take me to my Visualforce page. And you can see now it took me to my Visualforce page. Jobs demand. I click save. And then they used the save action. It took me back to the standard page for the speaker. So if you've ever wondered how do I override standard behavior, that's how you do it. With a Visualforce page where the standard controller equals the object, and then you go into the buttons, links, and actions, and then you override that's where you can override the behavior of the page. Does that make sense? Okay. It's a very common use case where you want to override the standard behavior of the page. Whoops, sorry. So let's go back to our lab. Where are we at on the lab? All right. So we did this. We did step 2, which we set the speaker form as the default form, and we tested it out. All right. So here's the method where we're going to create a custom controller extension. So in this module, we're going to write our own controller to do some sort of logic. So we're going to make a controller extension to do something, to pull in an image from Flickr and display it in our Visualforce page. And do we have time for this? Create object speaker. All right. So what you have to do is we have to create 2 fields on the speaker. Is this already in here? Text, picture, path. So let's go to setup. I'm going to go to objects again. I'm going to go to speaker. I have standard fields, bio, email, first name, last name. I have to add a new field, so I'm going to click new here. And it wants me to add text, field label, picture path. So I'm going to call it text. Next, let's call it picture path. So this is creating fields on our custom object. I'm going to give it 255 length. Is it required? No. Click next. Add it to all the field labels. That's fine. Add it to all the page layouts. It's fine. Give everybody access. So I'm going to follow the directions to add the picture path field, and I'm going to add the picture field. It's a formula. And it wants us to say create formula, picture, label is picture, and is a type. What is the type? Text. I'm going to click next. And I'm going to say the formula is image picture path. Okay. So this is basically creating a formula field which is going to display an image. It'll return an image URL, basically. Click set next. I know I'm going a little fast. It's because we're almost out of time. I want you to just see this at least. But we're almost done. So you add the 2 custom fields per the instructions on step 1, extending the data model. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom controller extension. So I'm going to go into my developer console and create this extension. New Apex class, speaker controller extension. I'm going to click OK. And then I'm going to copy this extension class he has here. I'm going to click File, Save. Okay. So now I have an Apex controller that's basically, if you look through this code, it has a couple attributes on it with getters and setters. That's going to make it accessible to bind to our Visualforce page as an expression. Remember, using the bracket exclamation point. I have a controller, which when it instantiates, it's going to do some logic. It's going to pull the speaker record into memory. I have a save operation. That when I save, it's going to save, and it's going to basically create a picture file from this servlet. Excuse me. So we're overriding, the important thing to note here is we're overriding the save operation. Remember, the last page we didn't overwrite the save, now we're overriding it. So it's going to do, it's basically going to update our speaker, but it's also going to create a related attachment record and attach it to the, and link it to the speaker record. Okay? So I'm going to copy this over. And like I said, as I was saying, the workbook's calling out that the save method's overriding the default behavior. Now what we want to do is we want to override the Apex page tag to say we want to use an extension. So here's my speaker override page, and I'm going to override my controller to say use the new speaker controller extension. And it says add a file. Oh, this isn't going to pull it in from Flickr. This is going to pull it in from my file. So it wants me to say add this field for a picture image. Yeah, the page block. So what I need to do is here I need to say Apex messages, page messages. Okay. So I'm going to click Save here. So now it should override it. It's going to give me a, remember, because I used an input field here, it's going to render the file input for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my page. I say edit the Steve Jobs guy. And now because I added that, see it has this, now it has this input choose file. So I say choose file. And I'm going to do this picture. Now when I click save, it's going to override the save action and execute that save method that's going to create an attachment and link it to the record. So you can see there, so what we did is we did a couple things there, okay? We overwrote the save action to say we want you to do our new save operation. When you do the new save operation, what I want you to do, so here's the Visualforce page, pretty light, right? But what we said is we want to say, we added this picture binding, and we said overwrite the save. When we did this controller extension, we named it the same as the save. That overwrote the standard save operation. So when you do this, execute the save, but execute the save on my controller extension. And inside our controller extension, we have the save method here. And what we did is we did update the speaker record with the binding values, the name, email, and the picture field. If they entered a picture, they chose a file and it wasn't null, then I wanted you to create an attachment record with that blob, with that file from the desktop, insert the attachment. Then after you've inserted the attachment, because now you have an ID, update the speaker path with the URL to basically get the image URL download, and update the speaker record. So we did 2 updates on the speaker record. We updated it with all my updates. We inserted the attachment. Then we updated the speaker record again with the link to that image file, the attachment, so it would display. And then our formula field displayed that as an image inline in the Visualforce page. So you can see it, when we saved it, it updated the file path there and then the image there. Yes? Upsert, correct. Upsert is basically what you can do is it does both insert or update depending on whether an ID is populated. And what you can do with an upserts are more valuable in system integrations. So if I create what's called an external ID field, I can do an upsert operation on that external ID, and that keeps it unique based on what, like the constraints. It's like a foreign key of an external system. And I can do an upsert operation. It's the same. It'll insert or update if that external ID exists. It is more time sensitive. I usually use upserts just because it's easier, but it is more, the thing to keep in mind is it is more time intensive because it has to check, does this person exist or not, and then insert it. So we're running out of time. We got 3 minutes left. We got through all of the lab work. We did not get to the extra credit, probably because I meandered along on some tidbits there. But that's basically the gist of it. So at this point, you guys should have everything you need to at least be very basically familiar with some of these concepts. You can go play and build whatever you want. So I'll open it up for questions for the next 2.5 minutes. And if you don't get your question answered here, hit me up on Twitter. Outside of the session, I'm happy to talk. Yes. Yeah, you could do a JavaScript library, image library to edit through the cropping. You could add a JavaScript library to your Visualforce page and then input that into using JavaScript. You could do that. You could also do things like you can do callouts and things like that too. So yes, you could do a JavaScript library in your Visualforce page that's an image library that lets you crop the file before you send it to the page. Other questions? Yeah. What is code coverage? Yeah, so we didn't get that in session, but it's necessity to go to production. So basically there's something called, if you're a Java developer, it's JUnit. If you're a .NET guy, I think it's called NUnit. It's basically unit testing your code to make sure that the system behavior is accurate. So for example, I would say on my trigger there, actually a good example is on that Visualforce page. I would write a unit test on that controller on the save method. And I would say, do a test save operation with that method, and then do what's called system.asserts. Assert that it actually created an attachment. So what unit test coverage is required on the platform, because Salesforce has 3 releases a year, and they want to make sure that anything custom you build, you don't break. So it's required to have 75% unit code coverage. There's a whole, unit testing in general is a whole big, that could be a class, a day class in and of itself, but writing unit tests is critical to production and maintaining your production instance. Good question. Yeah. Yeah. That's out of the box. You get the attachments out of the box, and they have a foreign key to a parent. It's called a parent ID, and it's actually what's called a polymorphic field. So parent ID is one of these special fields where it can link to any object in the system, so you can link attachments to anything in the system. It's a blob, yeah. It has a limit. You can only do about 10, I think it's 10 megabyte file for the attachments. There's other places you can store files in Salesforce also. But every object out of the box has attachments. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I know this was a fast session. Thanks for coming. Hopefully it was valuable. Hit me up on Twitter after this if you have questions. There should be a survey link, I think, in the chatter feed if you want to fill out the survey. Anyway, thanks for attending.